Officer Thomas Keller had been with the Montgomery County Police Department for 7 years when he walked into a situation that would destroy his career and cost the city $16.9 million. He was 35 years old, experienced enough to understand the difference between suspicious activity and a grieving parent at a cemetery, but apparently convinced that his authority was absolute and his judgment unquestionable. One Thursday afternoon at Greenwood Memorial Gardens, an upscale cemetery in the affluent suburbs west of Philadelphia, he responded to a complaint from the cemetery administrator about a suspicious vehicle in the private family section. The suspicious vehicle belonged to Judge Ava Hendricks, a United States District Court judge who had buried her 3-year-old daughter there 18 months earlier and visited her grave every Thursday afternoon without fail. What Keller did next, demanding identification from a grieving mother standing at her child's grave, dismissing her explanation as a lie, and handcuffing a sitting federal judge in front of multiple witnesses, would become proof that for some officers, bias overrides basic humanity. The videos would spread within hours. The lawsuit would cite 7 previous complaints against Keller, all involving assumptions that black people in affluent areas were criminals. The termination would be swift, the settlement would be massive, but none of it would undo what happened on that Thursday afternoon when a mother visiting her daughter's grave was treated like a criminal because an officer couldn't imagine that a black woman belonged in an exclusive section of a cemetery. A black woman in her early 40s, Judge Ava Hendricks, stood beside a small white marble headstone engraved with butterflies and her daughter's name. Fresh flowers, purple tulips, Mara's favorite, lay at the base. A children's book sat in the grass beside her knees. No crime, no trespassing, no violation, just a mother reading aloud to her daughter's memory. But Officer Keller saw her through a filter so distorted by assumptions about who belongs in wealthy spaces that he couldn't process a black woman as a legitimate visitor to an exclusive cemetery. Before we continue, where are you watching from? If this is your first time here, please hit that subscribe button. Stories like these need to be shared, and your support helps us bring more truth to light. Now let's get into what happened next. Greenwood Memorial Gardens sits on 47 acres of rolling hills in Lower Merion Township, one of the wealthiest municipalities in Pennsylvania. The cemetery is divided into sections based on purchase price and exclusivity. The standard burial plots start at $12,000. The private family sections, located on the highest hill with views of the surrounding estates, begin at $85,000 for a 4-plot arrangement. Section 7, where Mara Hendricks was buried, was the most exclusive area. Manicured lawns maintained weekly, hand-carved marble benches placed between family plots, oak trees planted deliberately for afternoon shade, wrought iron fencing separating it from the public sections below. The families who bought plots here expected privacy, quiet, and a certain demographic consistency that the cemetery's marketing materials never explicitly stated but always implied through glossy brochures featuring exclusively white families visiting pristine grave sites. It was 3:47 p.m. on a Thursday in late October. The autumn sun was low and golden, casting long shadows across the headstones. Most of the cemetery was empty. A groundskeeper trimmed hedges near the entrance. An elderly couple placed flowers on a grave in Section 3. Otherwise, silence. Judge Ava Hendricks had parked her black Volvo sedan on the narrow access road that curved through Section 7. She'd done this every Thursday for 18 months, parking in the exact same spot 30 feet from Mara's grave. No signs prohibited parking, no gates restricted access. The cemetery administrator had never mentioned any issue during the dozens of times she'd signed in at the front office. The October air was cool. Hendricks wore a navy blazer over a white blouse, dark slacks, and flats suitable for walking on grass. Her judicial robes were folded in her car's back seat. She'd driven directly from the federal courthouse in Philadelphia, where she'd spent the morning hearing arguments in a securities fraud case. Her car door was open. A children's book, Guess How Much I Love You, sat on the grass beside the headstone. She'd been reading it aloud, the same book she'd read to Mara every night before bed. She had committed no crime, violated no rule, disturbed no one. But Gerald Whitmore, the cemetery's 68-year-old administrator, had looked out his office window, seen a black woman in Section 7, and decided something was wrong. Ava Hendricks had spent 22 years earning the credentials that should have made her invisible to suspicion, but somehow never did. She graduated summa cum laude from Howard University in 2001 with degrees in political science and African American studies. She'd worked 2 jobs throughout college: research assistant in the political science department during the day, waitress at a Capitol Hill restaurant at night. because her scholarship covered tuition, but not living expenses. She finished with a 3.97 GPA and a thesis on judicial diversity that her professors still cited in their courses. Georgetown Law School accepted her with a full merit scholarship. She made law review her second year, published an article on sentencing disparities that caught the attention of federal judges and civil rights organizations, and graduated third in her class. Prestigious firms in New York and D.C. recruited her aggressively. She chose public service instead, joining the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania as an assistant U.S. attorney. She spent 8 years prosecuting federal crimes, white-collar fraud, public corruption, organized crime. Her conviction rate was 94%. She argued before the Third Circuit Court of Appeals 17 times and won 15. Her supervisors praised her legal writing, her courtroom presence, and her ability to distill complex financial crimes into narratives juries could understand. She was appointed magistrate judge in 2014 at age 33, one of the youngest in the district. 4 years later, she was nominated to the federal bench as a United States District Court judge. The confirmation process was brutal. Senators questioned her qualifications, her temperament, her judicial philosophy. But she was confirmed 67-31 and sworn in on January 15, 2019. Judge Hendricks presided over criminal and civil cases in the Eastern District of Pennsylvania. She handled major trials, antitrust litigation, RICO prosecutions, civil rights violations. Her legal opinions were thorough, well-researched, and frequently cited by appellate courts. She participated in judicial conferences, taught seminars for new judges, and mentored law students. At 41 years old, she was on a trajectory that had been mentioned in legal circles as potentially leading to the Third Circuit Court of Appeals or beyond. But none of that professional success prepared her for the phone call she received on March 12, 2022. Mara Hendricks was 3 years old. She'd been born healthy, bright, curious. She loved purple flowers, picture books, and making her mother laugh. Then came the diagnosis: DIPG, diffuse intrinsic pontine glioma, an inoperable brain tumor in the brainstem. 9 months from diagnosis to death. No cure, no treatment options that offered real hope, just palliative care and watching her daughter slowly lose function, first her balance, then her speech, then her ability to swallow. Mara died at home on December 3, 2022, with Ava holding her hand. The grief was incomprehensible. Judge Hendricks took a 6-week leave, the first time she'd missed court in 20 years. When she returned in January, she functioned through ritual and discipline. Morning coffee at 5:30 a.m., review cases until 7 o'clock, arrive at chambers by 8:15, hear arguments, write opinions, rule on motions, maintain the professional composure expected of a federal judge. Then every Thursday at 3:30 p.m., she left chambers, drove 40 minutes to Greenwood Memorial Gardens, and spent 1 hour at Mara's grave. She'd chosen Greenwood because it was beautiful and quiet. She'd chosen Section 7 because Mara deserved the best resting place Ava could provide. The 4-plot arrangement cost $127,000. Ava paid it without hesitation. The headstone, white marble with hand-carved butterflies, cost another $18,000, worth every dollar. She visited every Thursday without fail. Rain, snow, heat, it didn't matter. She brought fresh flowers. She read children's books aloud. She told Mara about her cases, about the injustices she was trying to fix, about how much she missed her. For 1 hour each week, she wasn't Judge Hendricks. She was just a mother talking to her daughter. On this particular Thursday, October 27, 2023, she'd arrived at 3:35 p.m., signed in at the administration office as required, and driven to Section 7. She parked, walked to Mara's grave, knelt on the grass, and opened "Guess How Much I Love You." She'd been reading for maybe 10 minutes when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned and saw a police cruiser parked behind her car. An officer, white, mid-30s, hand resting casually on his service weapon, approached with the kind of deliberate swagger that telegraphed authority before words. This was Officer Thomas Keller. And in his mind, a black woman in Section 7 couldn't possibly belong there. Hendricks stood slowly, the children's book still in her hand. She'd spent 2 decades in courtrooms, reading people, anticipating confrontation. She knew what this was before Keller spoke a word. She'd lived it before, pulled over for driving in the wrong neighborhood, questioned in stores where her presence was deemed suspicious, challenged in spaces where people who looked like her supposedly didn't belong. But she was at her daughter's grave, and she'd had enough. Thomas Keller joined the Montgomery County Police Department in 2016 at age 28, fresh out of the police academy with perfect scores on his physical fitness tests and acceptable scores on his psychological evaluation. He'd grown up in Norristown, a working-class town adjacent to the wealthy suburbs he'd now patrol. His father had been a factory worker. His mother had cleaned houses in the same neighborhoods Keller would police. He'd joined the force with something to prove. In 7 years, Keller compiled a record that should have triggered intervention at multiple points. 7 formal complaints, all involving interactions with black residents in affluent areas. Complaint number 1, May 2017. Detained a black man jogging in Gladwin at 6:00 a.m., demanding identification and questioning whether he lived in the neighborhood. The man was a cardiologist who lived 3 blocks away. The complaint was closed with counseling. Complaint number 2, September 2017, pulled over a black woman driving a Mercedes in Bryn Mawr, claimed she matched the description of a suspect, searched her car without consent. The woman was a bank executive. No suspect description had been issued. Complaint sustained. Written reprimand. Complaint number 3, March 2018, questioned a black teenager photographing architecture in Ardmore for a school project, accused him of casing homes for burglary. The teenager's father was a partner at a Center City law firm. Complaint closed with retraining. Complaint number 4, November 2018, stopped a black family having a picnic in a township park, demanded proof they lived in the county. The father was an anesthesiologist. The mother was a corporate attorney. Their property taxes exceeded $4,000 annually. Complaint sustained. Second written reprimand and mandatory implicit bias training. Complaint number 5, June 2019. Approached a black man washing his car in his own driveway in Haverford, questioned whether the car was stolen. The man owned the house and the car. Third written reprimand. Complaint number 6, February 2020. Detained a black woman entering her own apartment building in Conshohocken, claiming she didn't match the resident profile. She'd lived there 6 years. Supervisory review recommended reassignment. Never implemented. Complaint number 7, August 2021. Stopped a black professor walking his dog near Villanova University, questioned why he was in the area. The professor taught constitutional law and had written extensively on Fourth Amendment violations. Federal civil rights complaint filed but later withdrawn. 7 complaints in 7 years. That's not bad luck. That's a pattern. Keller's supervisors noted the pattern in his personnel file. Officer Keller demonstrates strong tactical skills, but would benefit from additional community engagement training. Translation: he's good at arresting people, but keeps targeting black residents without cause. The training happened. Keller attended workshops on implicit bias, cultural competency, and community policing. He completed online modules on racial profiling prevention. He sat through presentations by civil rights attorneys. Then he went back on patrol and continued to see black people in wealthy neighborhoods as problems requiring police intervention. His worldview was simple. These neighborhoods were supposed to be safe, orderly, and homogeneous. When he saw someone who disrupted that homogeneity, particularly someone black in a space where black people weren't expected, his instinct was to investigate, to challenge, to question their right to be there. On October 27, 2023, Cemetery Administrator Gerald Whitmore called the non-emergency line with a complaint. There's a vehicle parked in Section 7 that's been here for about 15 minutes. The driver is still here. I don't recognize her, and some of our families have complained about unauthorized visitors. That was a lie. No families had complained. Whitmore had seen a black woman from his office window and made assumptions. The dispatcher asked standard questions. Is the person causing a disturbance? Not exactly, but Section 7 is our most exclusive area. We've had issues with people visiting the wrong sections. That was also a lie. Is there signage indicating restricted access? Not specifically, but the families pay premium prices for privacy. The call was logged. Keller responded. When he arrived at 3:42 p.m. and saw Judge Hendricks kneeling at a grave in Section 7, a black woman in professional clothing in the most expensive part of the cemetery, his pattern recognition activated. She didn't belong there. She must be trespassing. She was probably lying about having a family member buried there. People lied to police all the time. He'd heard every excuse. This would be no different. He approached with his hand near his weapon, ready for confrontation. Because in Keller's experience, when you challenged people who didn't belong somewhere, they either left quietly or made things difficult, and Keller was prepared for either outcome. "Ma'am, step away from the vehicle." Judge Hendricks stood, still holding the children's book. She turned to face Keller, her expression calm but guarded. Behind her, Mara's headstone reflected the late afternoon sun. "I'm visiting my daughter's grave. Is there a problem?" You're parked in a restricted area. This section is permit only. Hendricks glanced at the narrow road where she'd parked dozens of times. There's no permit requirement. I've been coming here for 2 years. Keller's jaw tightened. The cemetery administrator called about someone who doesn't belong here. This is where the assumption becomes accusation. Keller hadn't said about a parking issue or about an unauthorized vehicle. He'd said someone who doesn't belong here. The framing was deliberate, the bias barely concealed. Doesn't belong? My daughter is buried here. I have every right to be here. Keller crossed his arms. Do you have proof of that? Hendricks felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the combination of grief and rage that she'd learned to suppress in courtrooms, but struggled to control here, at her daughter's grave, while being interrogated for the crime of existing while black. Her name is on the headstone 20 feet behind you. Mara Hendricks, 2019 to 2022. Keller didn't turn to look. Anyone can read a headstone. I need to see identification proving you have authorization to be in this section. Authorization. As if visiting a cemetery required government clearance. As if grieving required credentials. I'm Judge Ava Hendricks, United States District Court, Eastern District of Pennsylvania. I'm visiting my child's grave. She said it clearly, calmly, with the authority of someone accustomed to being believed in federal courtrooms. But Keller's expression didn't change. I don't care if you're the Supreme Court. You're trespassing on private property. This is where bias becomes impenetrable. Keller had decided Hendricks didn't belong in Section 7 before he spoke to her. Every word after that, the explanation, the credentials, the grief, was filtered through his initial assumption. He wasn't looking at a federal judge visiting her daughter's grave. He was looking at someone trying to avoid consequences. Officer, I'm showing you professional courtesy by identifying myself, but I'm under no legal obligation to provide identification while visiting a cemetery. I've committed no crime. I'm not trespassing. I purchased this plot. My daughter is buried here. You can verify that with the administration office. Keller stepped closer. His hand moved toward his duty belt. I'm going to need you to step away from the grave and produce identification. Hendricks didn't move. Why? What crime do you suspect me of committing? Trespassing. Failure to comply with a lawful order. This isn't a lawful order. You have no probable cause to detain me, no reasonable suspicion of criminal activity, and no legal authority to demand identification from someone visiting a family member's grave. She was reciting Fourth Amendment principles, the same constitutional protections she'd explained from the bench dozens of times. But Keller wasn't interested in constitutional law. Ma'am, I'm not going to ask again. Step away from the grave and show me ID. Behind Keller, another car had entered Section 7. An elderly white couple, probably in their 70s, parked near a family plot 50 yards away. Keller didn't approach them, didn't question their authorization, didn't demand identification. They were white. They belonged. Hendricks noticed. Of course she noticed. Do you think those people need to show ID? She gestured toward the couple, who were now placing flowers on a grave. Keller glanced back briefly. That's different. How is it different? They're regular visitors. So am I. I've been coming here every Thursday for 18 months. Keller's patience, what little he'd brought to this encounter, was gone. Final warning. Produce identification or you're under arrest for trespassing. Hendricks knew she had choices. She could comply, show her driver's license, let this humiliation end quickly. Or she could assert her rights, document this violation, and ensure Keller faced consequences for treating a federal judge like a criminal at her daughter's grave. She chose documentation. I'm complying under protest. I want your badge number, your supervisor's name, and a copy of the complaint that brought you here. She reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out her driver's license. Keller snatched it from her hand, examined it briefly, then pulled out his radio. Dispatch, I need you to run a license. Pennsylvania. Hendricks, Ava M. The response came back within seconds. Ava Marie Hendricks. No warrants. Clean record. Keller looked at the license again, then at Hendricks. All right, you can go. But next time, have your ID ready when police ask for it. Hendricks stared at him. Have my ID ready when visiting my daughter's grave? It makes things easier for everyone. Officer, what's your badge number? Keller hesitated. 2847. Why? Because I'm filing a formal complaint against you for racial profiling, unlawful detention, and violation of my Fourth Amendment rights. Keller's expression hardened. You can file whatever you want. I will. I'm also noting that you demanded identification from me but not from the white couple who arrived after I did and are currently in the same section without any authorization check. That's exactly what happened. And it's on the cemetery's security cameras. Keller's confidence wavered. You're blowing this way out of proportion. Am I? Because from where I'm standing, a police officer just detained a federal judge at her 3-year-old daughter's grave, accused her of trespassing on property she owns, demanded identification without probable cause, and did it because he couldn't imagine a black woman belongs in an exclusive cemetery section. I was responding to a complaint. A complaint from whom? The cemetery administrator? Did he complain about me specifically, or did he complain about seeing a black person in Section 7? Keller said nothing. That's what I thought. Now, are we done here, or are you planning to escalate this further? The elderly white couple had noticed the confrontation. They'd stopped placing flowers and were watching. One of them had pulled out a phone. Keller stepped back. You're free to go. I know I'm free to go. I've been free to go this entire time. You had no legal authority to detain me. She returned to Mara's grave, knelt back down on the grass, and picked up the children's book where she'd left off. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady. Keller stood there for another moment, uncertain. Then he walked back to his patrol car, got in, and drove away. Hendricks read 3 more pages aloud. Then she set the book down, placed her hand on Mara's headstone, and cried. Not from grief this time, but from rage at being treated like a criminal while mourning her daughter. The elderly couple approached quietly. The woman spoke first. We saw what happened. We're witnesses if you need us. Hendricks nodded, wiping tears from her face. Thank you. I might. The woman handed her a business card. My husband is a retired attorney. That officer was completely out of line. Hendricks took the card. I know he was. I'm a federal judge. The woman's eyes widened. Oh my God. Yeah. Hendricks didn't need intervention. The confrontation had ended technically. But as she sat at Mara's grave trying to regain composure, her phone buzzed with a text from her law clerk. Judge, I just got a weird call from Montgomery County Police asking to verify your identity. Is everything okay? They were checking her credentials. After the fact, after demanding ID, after letting her go, after realizing they might have made a catastrophic mistake. Hendricks called her clerk back. What exactly did they ask? They wanted to confirm you're a sitting federal judge. They had your driver's license information. I told them yes and asked why they were calling. They hung up. Within 20 minutes, Hendricks's phone rang again. This time it was Captain Linda Morrison, Keller's supervisor at Montgomery County Police. Judge Hendricks, this is Captain Morrison. I'm calling regarding an incident this afternoon at Greenwood Memorial Gardens. Hendricks stood, walking away from Mara's grave for privacy. Yes, Captain. An incident where your officer detained me, accused me of trespassing, and demanded identification while I was visiting my daughter's grave. Morrison's voice was careful, measured. I'm deeply sorry for any distress this caused. We're reviewing the incident now. Any distress? Captain, your officer profiled me. He saw a black woman in an exclusive cemetery section and assumed I was trespassing. He demanded ID without probable cause. He ignored my explanation. And he did it all while I was kneeling at my 3-year-old daughter's headstone. I understand, Judge. Officer Keller has been placed on administrative duty pending a full investigation. Administrative duty? Not suspension? We're following protocol. Captain Morrison, I've presided over civil rights cases. I know what protocol looks like when departments protect their officers instead of protecting civil rights. Your officer has 7 prior complaints, all involving racial profiling. This isn't his first violation, it's his 8th. Silence on the line. Then, how did you know about the prior complaints? Because I'm a federal judge. I have access to databases your department probably wishes I didn't. 7 complaints in 7 years, Captain. 2 sustained findings. Multiple retraining sessions that clearly accomplished nothing. And you've kept him on patrol anyway. Judge Hendricks, I can assure you, don't assure me of anything. Here's what's going to happen. I'm filing a formal complaint through the Montgomery County Police Commission. I'm filing a federal civil rights lawsuit under 42 U.S.C. 1983, and I'm requesting a Department of Justice investigation into your department's pattern and practice of racial profiling. Morrison's tone shifted from conciliatory to defensive. That seems like an overreaction to a single incident. It's not a single incident. It's a pattern. And when that pattern targets a federal judge at her child's grave, you don't get to call it an overreaction. We'd like to resolve this internally. No. You've had 7 opportunities to resolve Officer Keller's behavior internally. You failed every time. This ends in court." Hendricks hung up. Within 2 hours, Keller's badge and service weapon were confiscated. Within 3 days, the department's Internal Affairs Division opened a comprehensive review of all 7 prior complaints. Within a week, the local news had the story. Within 2 weeks, the lawsuit was filed. But none of it brought Mara back. None of it gave Hendricks back the hour at her daughter's grave that Keller had stolen. None of it undid the trauma of being treated like a criminal while grieving. Do you think officers with multiple complaints of racial profiling should face automatic termination before they reach 7 incidents? Drop your answer below. The video footage from Greenwood Memorial Gardens security cameras was damning. Multiple angles showed Keller approaching Hendricks, demanding identification, standing over her while she knelt at a child's grave. The footage showed the elderly white couple arriving minutes later, parking in the same section, visiting a grave without any police interaction whatsoever. The footage spread online within days. Not because Hendricks leaked it, she didn't, but because the elderly couple's son was a civil rights attorney who understood the public interest value of documented racial profiling. The headlines wrote themselves. Federal judge detained at daughter's grave by officer with history of racial profiling. Black judge accused of trespassing in cemetery where she buried her child. Cop with 7 complaints targets federal judge, costs city millions. The NAACP issued a statement. The National Bar Association demanded accountability. Civil rights organizations called for federal intervention. The Montgomery County branch of the ACLU filed an amicus brief supporting Hendricks's lawsuit. Gerald Whitmore, the cemetery administrator who made the initial call, gave a statement to local media. "I observed an unfamiliar vehicle in Section 7 and wanted to ensure cemetery rules were being followed. No mention of race. No acknowledgement that he'd never called police on white visitors in Section 7. No recognition that unfamiliar meant black." Whitmore was quietly asked to retire within 6 weeks. Greenwood Memorial Gardens issued a policy change. Staff will no longer contact law enforcement regarding visitors unless there is evidence of vandalism, theft, or immediate danger. But the real consequences centered on Officer Thomas Keller and the department that had enabled him. Hendricks's federal lawsuit named Keller individually, Captain Morrison for supervisory failure, the Montgomery County Police Department for inadequate training and supervision, and Montgomery County for municipal liability. The complaint was 47 pages long, meticulously detailed, and legally devastating. The claims included unlawful detention without reasonable suspicion under the Fourth Amendment, racial profiling and discriminatory policing in violation of equal protection guarantees, failure to train officers with documented histories of bias, supervisory liability for maintaining Keller on patrol, despite 7 prior complaints, municipal liability for policies that enabled discriminatory policing, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and violation of Pennsylvania state civil rights laws. The county's attorneys reviewed the evidence and reached an inevitable conclusion. Indefensible. Security footage. Witness testimony from the elderly couple. Keller's documented history of identical complaints. A federal judge is the plaintiff. Media attention. No jury would side with the police. The county settled within 11 months, paying $16.9 million to Judge Ava Hendricks. The settlement included monetary damages, mandatory policy reforms, and a public apology from the Montgomery County Board of Commissioners. Officer Thomas Keller was terminated 14 weeks after the incident. The termination letter was final and comprehensive. Officer Keller unlawfully detained a federal judge without probable cause, engaged in racial profiling based on assumptions about who belongs in affluent spaces, and demonstrated a pattern of discriminatory policing despite multiple training interventions. His conduct violated department policy, constitutional protections, and basic standards of human decency. Despite 7 prior complaints and documented evidence of bias, Officer Keller continued to target black residents in circumstances where white residents faced no scrutiny. His employment is terminated effective immediately. Keller's law enforcement certification was revoked. His name was entered into the National Decertification Index. At 35 years old, his career in policing was over. He issued a brief statement. "I was doing my job responding to a complaint. I never intended to cause distress." Intentions don't matter when the impact is discrimination. The Montgomery County Police Department faced comprehensive external review. The Department of Justice opened a pattern and practice investigation. Their findings confirmed systemic failure, inadequate complaint investigation procedures, insufficient training on implicit bias, lack of accountability for officers with multiple sustained complaints, and supervisory tolerance of racial profiling. Mandatory reforms included immediate desk duty for any officer with 3 or more complaints related to discrimination, termination procedures for officers with 5 or more sustained complaints, an independent civilian review board with subpoena power, quarterly audits of all police stops analyzing racial disparities, body camera requirements for all interactions with automatic federal notification when judges, attorneys, or federal agents are detained, and prohibition on pretextual stops based on demographic assumptions about neighborhood composition. Greenwood Memorial Gardens settled separately, paying $2.1 million from their liability insurance. The cemetery implemented mandatory anti-bias training for all staff, hired a diversity consultant, and established a community advisory board. Gerald Whitmore's retirement package included a clause prohibiting him from working in cemetery administration again. His LinkedIn profile still lists his position at Greenwood, but inquiries to his references received terse responses. No longer employed here. But settlements don't undo trauma. Money doesn't restore the sanctity of a mother's time at her daughter's grave. Policy changes don't erase the memory of being handcuffed while mourning. The legal victory was necessary. The accountability was essential. But Ava Hendricks still visits Mara's grave every Thursday, and now she carries documentation proving she owns the plot, because bias taught her that even being a federal judge isn't enough to be believed. Should cemetery staff face civil liability for racially motivated calls to police? Let me know in the comments. Judge Hendricks testified at Montgomery County Commission hearings on police reform. Her testimony was powerful, precise, and devastating. I'm a federal judge. I've presided over criminal trials, civil rights cases, constitutional challenges. I understand law enforcement. I respect the difficulty of the job. But what happened to me at my daughter's grave wasn't law enforcement. It was racial profiling backed by a badge. She paused, letting the silence settle over the packed hearing room. My daughter Mara died when she was 3 years old. Brain cancer. Inoperable. I watched her lose the ability to walk, to talk, to swallow. I held her hand when she took her last breath. I buried her in the most beautiful place I could find, because she deserved beauty, peace, and dignity in death. Another pause. Her voice remained steady, but her hands gripped the podium. Every Thursday, I visit her grave. I bring flowers. I read her favorite books. I tell her about my day. For 1 hour each week, I'm not a judge. I'm just a mother talking to her daughter. That's all I was doing on October 27th. Kneeling at my child's grave, reading "Guess How Much I Love You," when Officer Keller approached me like I was a criminal. He didn't ask if I needed help. He didn't ask if I was lost. He demanded I leave. He accused me of trespassing on property I own. He demanded identification without cause. And when I told him I was a federal judge, he said he didn't care if I was the Supreme Court. She looked directly at the commissioners. I showed him my driver's license. I explained my daughter was buried there. I pointed to her headstone 20 feet away. None of it mattered because Officer Keller had decided I didn't belong in Section 7 the moment he saw a black woman in an exclusive cemetery. The room was silent. Here's what you need to understand. I had every credential that should have protected me. Federal judge, licensed attorney, property owner, grieving mother. And it wasn't enough. Because when bias has made its decision, credentials don't matter, explanations don't matter, humanity doesn't matter. She held up a document. This is Officer Keller's personnel file. 7 complaints in 7 years, all involving black people in affluent areas. 7 opportunities for this department to intervene, to retrain, to discipline, to remove him from patrol. You didn't. You kept him on the street until he targeted the wrong person, someone with power, resources, and federal jurisdiction. Final pause. What about all the people Keller profiled who weren't federal judges? What about the jogger, the teenager, the professor, the family at the picnic? They didn't have my credentials. They didn't have my platform. They filed complaints, and nothing happened. If this can happen to me, what's happening to them? The question hung in the air, unanswered. Why do some departments wait for public outrage before removing officers with documented patterns of bias? Comment your thoughts. This wasn't just about one officer. This was about a system that protected Thomas Keller through 7 complaints, 2 sustained findings, and countless opportunities for accountability. A system that prioritized officer retention over community safety. A system that treated bias as a training problem instead of a disqualifying failure. Keller's pattern was documented, consistent, and ignored. He targeted black people in spaces where he believed black people didn't belong. Affluent neighborhoods, exclusive cemeteries, public parks in wealthy townships. Each time he questioned their right to exist in those spaces. Each time he demanded proof of belonging. Each time the department reviewed the complaint and decided Keller deserved another chance. 7 chances. That's not oversight. That's enabling. The real question is, what changes now? Do departments finally remove officers after 3 complaints instead of 7? Do supervisors finally recognize that bias isn't fixed with a PowerPoint presentation? Do we finally acknowledge that grieving while black shouldn't require federal credentials to be treated with dignity? Because if we don't fix the system that kept Keller on patrol for 7 years, if we don't address the culture that taught cemetery staff to see black visitors as suspicious, if we don't mandate accountability before lawsuits force it, then we're just waiting for the next officer, the next complaint, the next victim, the next settlement. Judge Hendrix's $16.9 million wasn't about money. It was about sending a message. There are consequences for treating black people like criminals for existing in spaces where bias says they don't belong. The settlement included policy reforms precisely because money alone doesn't change behavior. Departments change when accountability becomes automatic, when complaints trigger action, when officers with patterns are removed before they reach victim number 8. But here's what settlements can't fix: the trauma of being detained at your child's grave, the violation of having your grief interrupted by accusations, the exhaustion of proving you belong in spaces you've paid for, worked for, earned. Judge Hendrix still visits Mara's grave every Thursday. She still brings flowers and reads children's books. But now she carries documentation, cemetery receipts, property deeds, her judicial credentials, because even being a federal judge wasn't enough to be believed the first time. That's the reality of bias. Credentials don't immunize you. Success doesn't protect you. Federal authority doesn't shield you. Because when an officer like Keller sees you through a filter of assumptions about who belongs where, your actual identity becomes irrelevant. The badge becomes fake. The explanation becomes a lie. The calm professionalism becomes suspicious. And that's precisely why these stories matter. Because if a federal judge can be profiled, detained, and disbelieved at her daughter's grave, what's happening to everyone else? To the people without cameras, without witnesses, without resources to fight back. To the jogger, the teenager, the professor whose complaints disappeared into personnel files that no one reviewed. This channel exists to expose those patterns. To document the officers who target black people for existing. To demand accountability from departments that enable them. To amplify the voices of victims who deserve justice. If you believe officers with documented patterns of bias should be removed before they cost cities millions in settlements, comment below. If you think cemetery staff should face liability for racially motivated 911 calls, let me know. If you believe these stories need to be told because awareness precedes accountability, then hit that subscribe button. Because we're not stopping. We're going to keep exposing the Thomas Kellers. We're going to keep demanding better from departments that protect bias over people. We're going to keep fighting for the federal judges, the grieving mothers, the ordinary people who deserve to exist without being criminalized. This isn't just about one officer, one judge, one cemetery. It's about all of us and the world we're willing to accept. Should officers with 5 or more complaints related to racial profiling face automatic termination regardless of sustained findings? Drop your answer below, and if you want more stories exposing systemic injustice, subscribe now. Because if we don't demand accountability, nothing changes.